So let's talk about the auth section for configuring a ManyChat app. The auth section is actually an optional section. If your app hits APIs which don't need your request to be authenticated, you don't need to configure an auth block. But if you do hit APIs which are behind an API gateway and they maybe give you an API key, this is a section that you would configure. So let's get started on this, and I'm going to click on the plus button over here. This will show us the 4 sections that can be configured for the auth block here on the left. And on the right, you'll see an auth block JSON, which will change and show you the actual auth block JSON as you configure this, and then click on the save button. Now, each of these sections also shows a little badge number in a light bluish green background. And this is the number of items that are configured for that section. So if you look at the auth params right now, it's 0. And if I expand this, you won't see anything in there. Let's go ahead and configure an auth parameter. So I click on plus over here and expand this. Now, an auth parameter is an authentication parameter that is required by the API that your application is going to provide access to. So these would be things like any API keys that you need access to. Let's just say that I'm going to call it API_key, and this is going to be API key over here. My app API key is the UI label that will show up when a client of yours installs your app. And the API_key is the variable that you would be able to use across your app for passing the value of that API key. Now we also see this little group section over here. And if I set the group slider to true and I click on save, you'll see the JSON, it says group equals true over here. And this maps to the ManyChat app setup groups. So if group is true for a particular parameter, your user will be able to configure multiple values for that for different setup groups. So let's go to the next section, which is global request headers. So global headers are headers that you want going with every single HTTP request from your app. So these are things like content type, which might be common, for example, application JSON for all of your requests. So we're going to add content type. And if I configure this, every HTTP request will always have this HTTP header in there. Now, we configured the auth parameter, which was the API key. And maybe you also want the authorization header going out with every single request. So we can come here and add another global request header. And I'm going to call it authorization header, and then API_key, which is the variable that we configured. Now we have 2 global headers, which will go out with every single request. Now, maybe your API key doesn't expect the authorization header as part of a HTTP header, but it rather expects that you send the API as a query string in your URL. In that case, you can come to the query string and configure that over there. You wouldn't really configure your authorization header both in global request headers and query strings. So we're just going to show you an example where the same thing can go as a query string. I'm going to delete this from here for now. I'm going to expand the query string and click on plus over here. That lets me create a new query string. Now over here, this is your query string parameter. So maybe it's something like API token. And the value is, again, your API key. So you're going to pass that as a variable. And when you configure it this way, your API key is going to get passed as a query string in the HTTP URL you hit for a particular API access. Now, let's talk about the last section, which is the auth request. Since February 1st, 2021, ManyChat has been recommending that if your app needs access to ManyChat APIs, for whatever reason, maybe you want to trigger a flow when something happens externally, or you want access to ManyChat tags or any other API that ManyChat provides, you need a ManyChat API key for that. So there are 2 ways to get that. You could configure another auth param called ManyChat API key and ask the user to enter it manually over there. But what ManyChat recommends is to use an auth request section to get access to ManyChat API keys. So in this case, what ManyChat expects is that you have a backend API configured at your end, which can take a request from ManyChat, and then you would come here and configure the auth request. So let's say I've configured this section. And in this case, when your app is installed, ManyChat automatically generates a ManyChat API key and sends a request to this particular URL and this payload by default, which is the page ID and the app token being the ManyChat API key that got generated for you. If this particular API that you've configured also requires authentication, or it expects the app token as a HTTP request, you can go ahead and configure that over here. And so let's say I'm going to configure something called X token header. I can pass the value here of app token. And then in this case, ManyChat would send an HTTP request and pass the ManyChat API key as HTTP header called X token header. Now, if you clicked on save, you would see the entire auth block JSON show up over here.